A millionaire's perfect world crumbles. Maxwell Carter lived a life most people could only dream of. He had built his wealth through hard work and smart investments, and at the age of 38, he was one of the youngest millionaires in his city. His towering penthouse, with its breathtaking view of the skyline, was a reflection of his success. But for Maxwell, it was more than just the money and power. He had always prided himself on the life he had built, a life shared with his wife, Lillian. Maxwell and Lillian had been married for nearly 5 years. She was the embodiment of grace, beauty, and charm, someone who had stood by him during his meteoric rise. Together, they were the couple everyone admired. Maxwell, the charismatic entrepreneur, and Lillian, the picture-perfect wife. But, as Maxwell would soon discover, not everything was as perfect as it seemed. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Maxwell arrived home earlier than usual. He had wrapped up a few meetings and decided to surprise Lillian with a night in. They had been so busy with their lives lately, barely finding time for each other. All Maxwell wanted was to unwind, cook dinner together, and maybe talk about the future. The family they had been trying to start for years. The moment he entered their grand house, a sense of calm washed over him. The faint sound of water running from the upstairs bathroom told him that Lillian was home, showering. He set his keys down on the hallway table, smiling to himself. "Hello, love, I'm home," he called out, making his way up the staircase. "Just in the shower, darling. I'll be out in a minute." Lillian's voice was as sweet as ever, echoing from the master bathroom. As Maxwell passed the bedroom, something unusual caught his attention. One of the drawers in Lillian's dresser was slightly ajar, something that rarely happened. Maxwell wasn't one to snoop, but the untidiness felt out of place. His curiosity piqued. He reached for the drawer handle, intending to shut it properly. But as he did, he noticed something unusual. An old notebook tucked between Lillian's scarves. It was worn, with frayed edges, and looked like it hadn't been opened in a long time. Maxwell hesitated. Lillian was always meticulous about her belongings, so seeing this misplaced notebook made him feel uneasy. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The pages revealed intimate details about Lillian's life that Maxwell had never known. He flipped through the notebook, finding old memories, thoughts, and reflections. But it wasn't until a folded piece of paper fell out that his world began to shift. Maxwell unfolded the document, and his heart sank. It was a gynecologist's appointment slip, dated just after their honeymoon, detailing the implantation of a contraceptive device. A wave of confusion hit him like a ton of bricks. He and Lillian had been trying to have children for years, or at least that's what he had believed. Maxwell had spent sleepless nights worrying about why they hadn't conceived, visiting doctors and specialists, all while Lillian had remained calm, often brushing off the topic. His hands trembled as he folded the paper back and stuffed it into the notebook. The questions flooded his mind. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept this from him for so long? Had she never wanted children? The betrayal began to weigh heavily on his heart, as the realization sank in that the life they had been living was based on lies, deception that had gone unnoticed for years. The sound of the bathroom door opening snapped Maxwell back to the present. Lillian stepped out, her hair wrapped in a towel, her skin glistening with moisture. She flashed him a radiant smile. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked casually, walking over to plant a kiss on his cheek. For a moment, Maxwell considered confronting her right then and there. The words were on the tip of his tongue, but something stopped him. He felt numb, unsure of how to even begin. How do you confront the person you love about a betrayal so deep, so personal? "Fine," he replied, his voice barely audible. I just got home." Lillian seemed oblivious to the tension radiating from him. She continued to chat about her day, her plans, and a charity event she was organizing. All the while, Maxwell stood there, his mind racing. Later that evening, while Lillian was busy in the kitchen, Maxwell sat in the living room, staring blankly at the floor. The house felt cold, the walls closing in around him. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of anger, sadness, and confusion. How had he missed the signs? What else was she hiding from him? As he sat there, lost in thought, a soft thud echoed through the hallway. Maxwell furrowed his brow, wondering if Lillian had dropped something. But then came another sound, this one more distinct. It was a gentle knock at the front door, barely audible over the rain pattering against the windows. Maxwell rose from the couch, his heart still heavy from the discovery earlier. He approached the door and hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. There on the doorstep sat a small basket. For a moment, Maxwell thought it was some kind of mistake, but as he leaned closer, his breath caught in his throat. Inside the basket, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a baby, no more than a few months old. The infant's dark eyes stared up at him, unblinking, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Maxwell's mind went blank. He looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty, the rain falling in sheets. His heart pounded as he crouched down to pick up the basket. Who would leave a baby here? And why? As he cradled the small child in his arms, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. His life, already turned upside down by Lillian's betrayal, was about to take an even more unexpected turn. Little did Maxwell know, this abandoned baby would change everything. His perspective, his future, and ultimately, his heart. He closed the door behind him, holding the child close, the question swirling in his mind. But as he looked into the baby's innocent eyes, something inside him began to shift, a feeling he hadn't expected. Unraveling the truth. Maxwell stood frozen in his grand hallway, cradling the small baby in his arms. The soft, rhythmic sound of the rain outside was the only thing that kept him grounded as his mind raced to comprehend the situation. His life, once so meticulously planned and predictable, now felt like it was spiraling out of control. The shock of Lillian's secret was still fresh in his heart, but this tiny, innocent child left on his doorstep, had thrown everything into a disarray he couldn't have anticipated. The baby stirred, letting out a soft coo, drawing Maxwell's attention back to the fragile life in his arms. He gazed down, studying the little face. Round cheeks, a button nose, and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. The baby, no more than a few months old, seemed content despite the cold and the rain. Maxwell couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness, a primal instinct kicking in as the child's tiny fingers curled around the edge of his suit jacket. "Lillian," Maxwell called out, his voice a mixture of confusion and urgency. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for her to respond, his mind still reeling from the weight of everything he had just discovered. Moments later, Lillian appeared in the hallway, her face a picture of casual calm. She was wiping her hands with a kitchen towel, clearly expecting some mundane request, but when she saw the baby in Maxwell's arms, her expression faltered. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in their marriage, Maxwell saw something in her face he hadn't noticed before. Fear. What's going on?" she stammered, her eyes darting between the baby and Maxwell. "I was about to ask you the same thing," Maxwell replied, his voice colder than he intended. He gestured toward the door. "I found this baby outside on our doorstep. Do you have any idea what's going on?" Lillian's face paled. She shook her head, stepping closer to inspect the child, but her hands remained at her sides, almost as if she were too afraid to touch the baby. "Maxwell, I don't know what this is. This has nothing to do with me, I swear." Maxwell's heart pounded in his chest. A part of him wanted to believe her. After all, what reason would she have to know anything about this? But after the discovery of her secret, the contraceptive implant, and the lie about wanting children, he wasn't sure if he could trust anything she said anymore. The baby let out a soft whimper, pulling Maxwell's attention away from his wife. He looked down at the infant, feeling a strange sense of responsibility wash over him. There was something about the innocence of the child, something pure and untouched by the lies and betrayals of the adult world, that made him feel compelled to act. "We need to call the authorities," Lillian said, her voice shaking slightly. "We can't just keep a baby that was left on our doorstep. Someone is probably looking for them." Maxwell frowned. The thought of handing this child over to the police or social services felt wrong somehow, though he couldn't explain why. He wasn't naive. He knew the complexities of abandoned children, and yet a part of him felt drawn to protect this baby at all costs. Perhaps it was the overwhelming sense of loss he felt after uncovering Lillian's betrayal, the childlessness he had agonized over for years, now crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Or perhaps it was something more instinctual, a deeper connection forming between him and this tiny life that had been thrust into his care. "We'll call," Maxwell said slowly, "but let's make sure the baby's okay first. We don't know how long they've been out there." Lillian nodded, though there was a noticeable tension in her posture. Maxwell watched as she hesitated, her eyes flickering to the baby and then away, as if looking at the child brought her some kind of discomfort. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but in the moment, his priority was the baby. He carried the infant into the living room and gently laid the child on the plush couch, wrapping them in a soft blanket from a nearby armchair. The baby's wide eyes followed his every movement, and Maxwell found himself mesmerized by the trust and vulnerability in those tiny, unblinking eyes. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but there was also something else, a flicker of hope, like this child had arrived in his life for a reason, even if he couldn't see it yet. Lillian stood by the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "I'll get some water or formula, or something. We don't have anything for a baby, Max." Maxwell nodded absently, already engrossed in the child. He knew Lillian was right. They were wholly unprepared for this, but the idea of letting the baby go was already beginning to gnaw at him. Something about the situation felt too strange, too sudden. Why here? Why now? And why had the baby been left with them, of all people? As Lillian disappeared into the kitchen, Maxwell noticed something unusual tucked beneath the blanket that had been wrapped around the child. A small, folded piece of paper was wedged into the baby's makeshift swaddle. He frowned, carefully pulling it free without disturbing the infant. His heart raced as he unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry, but the words were clear. "Please take care of her. You're her only hope." Maxwell's breath caught in his throat. The cryptic message sent a shiver down his spine. Who was her? Why had the baby been entrusted to him? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Someone had specifically chosen him to care for this child. But who and why? Just as he was about to call out to Lillian again, he heard her voice in the hallway, murmuring something under her breath. His eyes narrowed. It wasn't a conversation he could hear clearly, but it sounded like she was on the phone. Instinctively, Maxwell rose from the couch and moved toward the doorway, careful to keep his footsteps quiet. As he approached, he could make out fragments of her conversation. Words like urgent and can't wait. His stomach churned. Was she hiding something? Again. Before he could piece anything together, Lillian abruptly ended the call and turned, startled to see Maxwell standing behind her. Her face flushed with guilt for a split second before she forced the smile. "I was just calling the police," she said, her voice unnaturally bright, "to let them know about the baby." Maxwell's gaze hardened. He didn't know what was going on, but something about her tone, her body language, it was all wrong. "Who were you really talking to?" Maxwell asked, his voice low, suspicion creeping into his words. Lillian's smile faltered, and for a moment she looked as if she might deny it. But then she let out a heavy sigh and shook her head. "It's not what you think, Max. I'll explain everything." Maxwell's heart pounded in his chest as a chilling realization began to take root in his mind. There was more to this than he could have imagined. And whatever it wasn't just about the baby. It was about his wife, and the secret she had been keeping. "Explain now," Lillian, Maxwell demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. What's going on? Lillian swallowed hard, her eyes filling with a strange mix of regret and something else, something darker. Max, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Maxwell's world, already on the brink of collapse, teetered even closer to the edge as he braced himself for the truth. Whatever Lillian was about to reveal, he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change forever. Lillian's dark confession. Maxwell's pulse quickened as he stared at Lillian, the tension in the room so thick it felt suffocating. His mind was already reeling from the discovery of the baby, the cryptic note, and now the unmistakable realization that Lillian had been hiding something far more sinister than he could have ever anticipated. The weight of her betrayal still clung to him like a dark cloud, but this was different. There was a new kind of fear in her eyes, one that he had never seen before. Lillian took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. For a moment, Maxwell saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the elegance, the grace, but it was quickly overshadowed by the deep secrets she had been harboring. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted things to get this far, but I didn't know how to stop it once it started." Maxwell clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to remain calm. He needed to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "What are you talking about, Lillian? Stop what? What does this have to do with the baby?" Lillian's gaze flickered to the child, still peacefully resting on the couch, wrapped in the blanket. Her face softened for a brief moment, but then the tension returned, and she met Maxwell's eyes with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I never told you the whole truth about my past," she admitted, her voice shaky. "Before I met you, I was involved with someone dangerous. It was a relationship I deeply regret, but it's not as simple as just walking away from it. There were consequences." Maxwell's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to make sense of her words. He had always known that Lillian came from a more modest background, but she had never been forthcoming about her life before they met. Now, he was starting to understand why. "Who was he?" Maxwell asked, his voice hardening. "And what do you mean by dangerous?" Lillian swallowed hard, avoiding his gaze. "His name is Victor. He's involved in a criminal network, one that stretches far beyond anything I could have ever imagined when I first met him. I was young and naive, and by the time I realized what I had gotten myself into, it was too late. I tried to leave, but Victor, he doesn't let people leave." Maxwell's blood ran cold. The mention of a criminal network immediately sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. He had always thought Lillian's life before him was unremarkable, simple even. But now he was realizing that she had been hiding a past tangled in danger and deception. "What does any of this have to do with the baby?" Maxwell asked again, his voice rising with frustration. "Why was a child left on our doorstep? And why do I have a note telling me I'm her only hope?" Lillian's face crumpled, and she turned away, as if the weight of her confession was too much to bear. "Because that child, that baby, is Victor's." Maxwell felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. His heart hammered in his chest, disbelief surging through him. "Victor's? What are you saying, Lillian?" "I'm saying that Victor is the father of that baby," Lillian said, her voice shaking. "He had a child with another woman, someone involved in his criminal world. But the woman, she disappeared. No one knows if she ran away or if something worse happened to her, but the baby was left behind, and Victor, he doesn't care. He's dangerous, Max. He's done terrible things, and I think the mother knew that. That's why she left the baby on our doorstep, because she knew that I knew Victor, and maybe she thought I could protect her child." Maxwell stared at her in disbelief. His mind was spinning, the shock of it all crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "You're telling me that this child is the daughter of a criminal, and we've just been pulled into whatever mess he's made." Lillian nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't want to involve you in this, Max. I didn't want to bring this danger into our lives. But Victor, he's not the kind of man you can just walk away from. I thought I could keep you safe, but now, with the baby here—" Her words trailed off, and she wiped at her eyes, clearly overwhelmed. Maxwell stood there, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and confusion. The woman he thought he knew had kept a past filled with criminal connections hidden from him. And now, because of her, there was an innocent child in their home, linked to a dangerous world. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" Maxwell asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "We've been married for years, Lillian. Years. And you never once mentioned that you were involved with a criminal. That you had these kinds of people in your past." Lillian's shoulders sagged under the weight of his words. "I was afraid, Max. Afraid that if I told you, you would leave me. Afraid that if I brought up Victor's name, he would somehow find us. I thought I could outrun him. That if I left that life behind, it would disappear. But it didn't. He's still out there. And now we have his child." Maxwell rubbed his hands over his face, trying to process everything. He looked down at the baby on the couch, her innocent eyes blinking up at him, as if unaware of the dangerous world she had been born into. He couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility for her, even though she was a stranger, even though she was tied to a criminal whose name sent shivers down his spine. "What happens now?" Maxwell asked quietly, more to himself than to Lillian. "What do we do with her?" Lillian's voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, "I don't know. But if Victor finds out that we have his child, I'm scared of what he might do." Maxwell stood there, frozen, as the gravity of their situation sank in. He had gone from discovering his wife's betrayal to uncovering a web of criminal ties and secrets that now threatened to unravel his entire life. And yet there was something in him that refused to abandon the child. He couldn't explain it, but the thought of handing her over to anyone, even the authorities, felt wrong. She had been left in his care for a reason, and now he had to figure out what that reason was. "We can't keep her here," Lillian said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "It's too dangerous. We need to figure out a way to get her to safety, away from Victor, away from anyone who might come looking for her." Maxwell nodded, though his mind was already spinning with plans, possibilities, and the terrifying realization that their lives had just been thrown into chaos. But there was no turning back now. The baby's innocent eyes, the weight of her tiny body in his arms, it had awakened something in Maxwell that he hadn't expected. As much as his trust in Lillian had been shattered, and as much as he feared the dangers that lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to abandon this child. Not now. Not ever. "We'll figure it out," Maxwell said finally, his voice firm. "But we can't go to the authorities yet. If Victor is as dangerous as you say, we need to be smart about this. We need to make sure we're not putting her in even more danger." Lillian looked at him with a mixture of relief and guilt, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on her." Maxwell nodded, though his mind was still reeling. He had no idea what the future held for them, for him, for Lillian, or for the baby. But he knew one thing. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. The descent into chaos. The weight of Lillian's confession had settled over Maxwell like a suffocating fog, clouding his thoughts and tightening his chest. The gravity of their situation now felt more ominous with every passing minute. He had always thought his life was one of security, successful, predictable, meticulously managed. Now, that life was gone, and in its place stood the growing storm of uncertainty and danger. The abandoned baby, now dozing quietly in her makeshift bed on the couch, had been thrust into their lives as a reminder of just how fragile it all was. Maxwell stared out the large bay windows of their living room, watching the rain beat down against the glass, blurring the city lights beyond. It was late, and the penthouse was cloaked in an unsettling silence. He could feel Lillian's presence lingering behind him, tense and full of regret. She hadn't moved since her confession, and neither had he. It was as if they were both frozen, caught in the eye of a storm they didn't know how to weather. "I should have told you." Lillian's voice broke through the stillness. Her words were soft, filled with guilt and sorrow. "I should have told you everything from the beginning, Max. But I didn't know how to escape that world, how to leave Victor behind without dragging you into it." Maxwell remained silent for a moment longer, his mind still processing the enormity of what had just been revealed. His marriage, which he had thought was built on love and trust, was crumbling before his eyes. And now, they were entangled in a web of crime and danger that stretched far beyond anything he had ever imagined. "You should have told me," he finally said, his voice laced with both anger and sadness. "We could have dealt with it together, Lillian. Instead, you let this fester, let it grow into something far worse. Now we're in the middle of something that neither of us can control." Lillian's shoulders slumped, and she crossed her arms as if trying to hold herself together. "I thought I could protect you," she whispered, barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I thought that if I just buried it deep enough, it would never touch us. But I was wrong." Maxwell let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You thought you could protect me by lying, by hiding a part of your life that could have destroyed us both. And now, this baby, Victor's child, is in our home. We're connected to him in ways I never wanted to be." Lillian's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she stepped closer to him, her voice pleading. "I didn't know this would happen. I didn't know she would be left on our doorstep. But Max, we can't abandon her. That baby has no one else. If we don't protect her, who will?" Maxwell turned to face Lillian, his heart aching from the weight of her words. As much as he wanted to be furious with her, to push her away for the lies she had told, he couldn't deny that the baby had changed something inside of him. He couldn't walk away from the innocent life that had been placed in his care, no matter how tangled it was in a dangerous world he wanted no part of. "I know," Maxwell said quietly, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know we can't abandon her, but we also can't pretend that everything is fine. Victor is out there, and he's not the kind of man to just forget about something like this. If he finds out we have his child, I don't even want to think about what he'll do." Lillian's face twisted in fear at the mention of Victor, and she wrapped her arms around herself even tighter. "He can't find out, Max. He can't know that she's here." "But how long can we keep that a secret?" Maxwell demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "This isn't something we can hide forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to come looking for her." Lillian opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the sound of a sharp knock at the door echoed through the room. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the entrance of the penthouse. Maxwell's heart skipped a beat, and Lillian's face drained of color. "Who could that be?" Lillian whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Maxwell's stomach twisted with dread. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the timing felt too coincidental. Could it be Victor? Had he already found them? The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins, and Maxwell moved quickly toward the door, motioning for Lillian to stay back. "Stay with the baby," he ordered quietly, his voice firm. Lillian nodded, her hands trembling as she hovered near the couch where the child still slept, oblivious to the mounting tension around her. Maxwell approached the door cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced through the peephole, half expecting to see a dangerous figure lurking on the other side. But instead, what he saw left him even more perplexed. A young woman, no older than her mid-20s, stood in the hallway, drenched from the rain. She was clutching something tightly in her hands, her face pale and drawn with fear. Maxwell's eyes narrowed in suspicion as he debated whether to open the door. She didn't look like a threat, but given everything that had happened tonight, he wasn't about to let his guard down. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to see her more clearly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman's eyes widened when she saw him, and she glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping closer. "Hi, I'm looking for Lillian Carter," she said in a shaky voice. "I need to speak to her. Please, it's urgent." Maxwell's heart skipped another beat. How did this stranger know Lillian's name? His gut told him something wasn't right, but before he could respond, Lillian appeared behind him, her face ashen. "Isabella," Lillian whispered, her voice filled with shock and recognition. The young woman, Isabella, nodded, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Lillian, I'm so sorry for coming here like this, but I didn't know where else to go. I had to find you." Maxwell's mind raced as he looked between the two women, confusion flooding his thoughts. "Who is she, Lillian?" he asked, his voice hard. Lillian took a deep breath, her gaze locked on Isabella. She's the one who left the baby. She's Victor's sister." The revelation hit Maxwell like a punch to the gut. Victor's sister. The same man who had terrorized Lillian's past and was now a looming threat over their lives. He stared at Isabella, his mind spinning with questions. Isabella's eyes welled up with tears as she stepped forward, her voice pleading. "I didn't know what else to do. My brother, he's not going to stop Lillian. He's going to come after her, after the baby. He knows she's gone, and he's going to find out where she is. I thought if I brought her here, if I left her with you, maybe she would be safe. But now he's looking for both of you." Maxwell's pulse raced, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. This was bigger than he had anticipated, far more dangerous than he had imagined. Victor wasn't just a shadow from Lillian's past. He was a very real, very immediate threat. And now, not only were they entangled in his criminal web, but his own sister had brought the storm to their doorstep. Lillian looked at Isabella with a mixture of fear and sympathy, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you come to me sooner, Isabella? Why didn't you tell me this before?" Isabella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know who else to trust. I've been running from him for months, trying to protect the baby. But he's always one step behind me. Lillian, he's dangerous. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants." Maxwell felt a surge of protectiveness as he glanced at the baby, still sleeping soundly on the couch, oblivious to the chaos swirling around her. This child, this innocent life, had been born into a world of violence and betrayal, and now it was up to him and Lillian to protect her from the storm that was closing in. Maxwell's mind raced with a million questions, but there was no time to dwell on them. He needed to act. They needed to act. If Victor was already searching for them, it was only a matter of time before he found them. "We need to leave," Maxwell said, his voice firm with resolve. "We need to get out of here before Victor finds us." Lillian nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also determination. "We'll pack quickly. Isabella, you're coming with us." Isabella hesitated, her eyes wide with shock. "But—" "No buts," Maxwell cut her off. "You're the only one who knows what we're up against. We're not going to survive this unless we stick together." As the rain continued to pour outside, Maxwell felt the weight of their next steps pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. They were in too deep, and the only way out was through. But with every step forward, the danger grew closer, and Maxwell knew that the battle for their lives and the baby's future was only just beginning. The flight to safety. The next few minutes felt like hours as Maxwell, Lillian, and Isabella rushed around the penthouse in a frenzied attempt to gather everything they would need to leave. The reality of their situation hung heavily in the air. A criminal mastermind was hunting them, and there was no time to waste. Every passing second felt like a countdown to disaster. Maxwell's mind raced as he stuffed essentials into a duffel bag: clothes, important documents, cash. He had never imagined his life would spiral into something straight out of a crime thriller. Just days ago, he had been a successful businessman with what seemed like a perfect life. Now he was preparing to go on the run with his wife, a woman who had lied to him, her former lover's sister, and an abandoned baby tied to a criminal empire. The baby. Maxwell's eyes darted to the couch where the child still slept peacefully, unaware of the danger swirling around her. The innocence in her small face was in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them, and Maxwell felt a pang of responsibility. Protecting this baby wasn't just a duty anymore, it was personal. She had been thrust into his life, and now her safety was tied to his own survival. Lillian hurried into the living room, her face flushed with panic. She was carrying another small bag, hastily filled with clothes and a few supplies for the baby. "We can't stay here much longer, Max," she said, her voice trembling. "Victor has connections everywhere. If Isabella is right, it's only a matter of time before he tracks us down." Maxwell nodded, zipping up his bag and slinging it over his shoulder. "We'll take the car and head somewhere off the grid. We need to stay ahead of him, at least until we can figure out what to do next." Isabella, who had been standing nervously by the door, spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. "I know a place. It's not far from the city. An old cabin in the woods that Victor doesn't know about. I used to go there when I needed to get away from him. We can hide out there, at least for a little while." Maxwell glanced at her, sizing her up. She was still a stranger to him, but in this moment, she was also their best chance at staying alive. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "We'll go there, but if anything seems off, we leave immediately." Isabella nodded, her eyes wide with fear but filled with resolve. "I understand." Maxwell scooped the baby into his arms, careful not to wake her, and glanced at Lillian. She looked pale, her eyes rimmed with the weight of guilt and fear, but she moved with a quiet determination that told him she was ready to fight for their survival. Despite the anger and betrayal simmering between them, Maxwell knew that now wasn't the time for confrontation. They needed to be a united front, at least until they were safe. "Let's go," Maxwell said, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time." They left the penthouse in silence, slipping into the cold, rain-soaked night. The city, usually vibrant and alive, felt like a hostile place now, filled with unseen dangers lurking in every shadow. Maxwell's heart raced as he ushered Lillian and Isabella into the sleek black SUV parked in the underground garage. He placed the baby gently in the back seat, securing her as best as he could with the limited supplies they had. Maxwell slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the hum of the powerful vehicle vibrating beneath him. He cast one last glance at the towering building that had been his home for years. In this moment, it felt more like a cage, a place where everything he thought he knew had come crashing down. Without another word, he put the car in gear and sped out of the garage, merging into the rain-slicked streets. The drive was tense, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken fears. The city lights faded behind them as Maxwell drove farther from the center of town, the roads becoming narrower and more deserted. The rain continued to fall in thick sheets, the wipers working furiously to keep the windshield clear. Every car that passed them, every shadow on the road, sent Maxwell's nerves on edge. He couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see Victor or his men tailing them. "How far is this cabin?" Maxwell asked, breaking the oppressive silence. "About an hour outside the city," Isabella replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's hidden pretty deep in the woods. No one will find us there unless they know where to look." Maxwell nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He knew they were running out of options, and for now, Isabella's plan seemed like their best bet. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger storm. Lillian sat quietly beside him, her hands clasped in her lap. She hadn't said much since they left the penthouse, and Maxwell could feel the tension between them growing with every mile they drove. He wanted to ask her more about Victor, about her past, but now wasn't the time. They needed to stay focused on getting to safety. The road grew darker as they ventured deeper into the countryside, the city now a distant memory. Maxwell's eyes scanned the road ahead, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain had intensified, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead of the car. He slowed down, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen if they were caught, if Victor found them before they could figure out a plan. "Turn left up here," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the tension. "It's a dirt road. It's hard to see, but it's there." Maxwell followed her instructions, squinting through the rain until he spotted the narrow, unmarked road she was talking about. He turned onto it, the car bouncing slightly as they left the paved highway behind and entered a thickly wooded area. The road was rough, overgrown with weeds and potholes, but Maxwell pressed on, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. After what felt like an eternity, the outline of a small, weathered cabin came into view. It was nestled deep within the forest, hidden among towering trees and thick underbrush. Maxwell exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was something. A temporary refuge from the chaos they had left behind. Maxwell parked the car and quickly got out, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of movement. The cabin looked abandoned, its wooden exterior weathered and worn by time. But it was secluded, and right now, that was all that mattered. "Let's get inside," he said, his voice urgent as he opened the back door and gently lifted the baby out of her seat. Lillian and Isabella followed closely behind, their footsteps splashing through the puddles forming around the car. Isabella hurried ahead and unlocked the cabin door, pushing it open with a creak. The interior was sparse and musty, the faint smell of damp wood hanging in the air. There were a few pieces of worn furniture, an old couch, a wooden table, and a small kitchenette in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Maxwell stepped inside, glancing around the dimly lit space. "It'll have to do," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He carefully laid the baby down on the couch, wrapping her in a blanket from the car. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. Lillian stood by the door, her arms wrapped around herself as she looked at Maxwell. There was a fragility in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, and for a moment, he almost forgot the anger simmering beneath the surface. They were both scared, terrified, even, and that fear had a way of making everything else seem insignificant. "We need to figure out what to do next," Maxwell said, his voice low but firm. "We can't stay here forever. Victor will be looking for us, and we need to be one step ahead." Isabella nodded, her face pale. "I'll keep watch tonight. If anyone comes near, we'll know." Maxwell didn't like the idea of leaving her to keep watch alone, but they didn't have many options. "We'll take shifts," he said, glancing at Lillian. "One of us should always be awake." Lillian nodded, though her eyes were distant. She hadn't said much, and Maxwell could sense that there was still more she hadn't told him, more secrets lurking beneath the surface. As the night wore on, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a fine line between survival and disaster. The cabin, while remote, didn't feel like the sanctuary they needed. It felt like a temporary reprieve, a pause in the storm that was still building. Maxwell sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the trees outside cast long, ominous shadows across the ground. Somewhere out there, Victor was hunting for them, and it was only a matter of time before he found them. Maxwell's hand rested on the windowsill, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know how they were going to get out of this, but one thing was clear: the fight for their lives, and for the baby's future, was far from over. And the storm was far from passing. The final stand. The night dragged on, the oppressive silence inside the cabin broken only by the occasional crackle of the wind or the creak of the old wooden beams. Maxwell remained at the window, his eyes scanning the shadowy forest beyond. The baby slept soundly on the couch, her innocent slumber an almost painful contrast to the turmoil building in the room. Lillian sat nearby, her fingers twitching anxiously, while Isabella stood guard by the door, her face pale but determined. Maxwell hadn't slept. His mind was a storm of thoughts, Strategies, plans, worst-case scenarios, each one darker than the last. How long could they hide here? How long before Victor found them? And what would happen when he did? The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the dense forest surrounding the cabin seemed to close in on them, as if even nature itself was conspiring to keep them trapped. Maxwell knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Hiding was never going to be a long-term solution. A sudden movement outside caught his attention. Maxwell's body tensed as he leaned forward, peering into the murky night. Something had shifted in the shadows, a flicker of movement just beyond the tree line. His heart raced, and he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Isabella," he whispered sharply. "There's someone out there." Isabella's head snapped toward him, her hand instinctively moving to the pistol she had hidden in her jacket. Lillian stood up, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. Maxwell turned back to the window, watching as the figures began to emerge from the shadows, their silhouettes barely visible in the dark. 3 men, armed, moving with purpose. Victor's men. Maxwell's pulse quickened. His worst fear was now standing just outside the cabin, and the flimsy wooden walls that had provided a false sense of security now felt like they were made of paper. "They found us," Maxwell said, his voice low but firm. "We need to move. Now." Isabella's face tightened with resolve. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it seemed to hit harder than she expected. "We don't have much time. They'll surround the cabin." Maxwell turned to Lillian, who stood frozen in fear. "Get the baby," he ordered. "We have to go, right now." Lillian nodded, rushing to the couch and carefully scooping the child into her arms. The baby stirred, but Lillian's soft, soothing touch kept her from waking fully. Maxwell could see the terror in his wife's eyes, but there was also something else. Determination. Despite everything, despite the lies and betrayal, Lillian was ready to fight for this baby, for their survival. "We can try the back exit," Isabella said, her voice tight. "There's a trail that leads deeper into the woods. If we're lucky, we can lose them in the trees." Maxwell's mind raced. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was their only chance. "Let's go." Isabella led the way, carefully opening the back door of the cabin. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the damp scent of rain and earth. Maxwell could hear the men moving closer outside, their footsteps heavy on the wet ground. They were getting closer. Maxwell followed Isabella out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Lillian came behind him, holding the baby close as they slipped into the dense cover of the trees. The forest was dark, the towering pines casting long shadows across the ground. The path Isabella had mentioned was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and thick underbrush. But they pressed on, moving as quietly as possible, their footsteps muffled by the soft, wet earth. Behind them, the sound of breaking glass shattered the night. "They'd broken in," Lillian whispered, her voice shaking. Maxwell's stomach twisted. They didn't have much time. Victor's men were inside the cabin now, and it wouldn't take long for them to realize their targets had fled. He pushed Lillian forward, urging her to move faster. The baby whimpered softly, sensing the tension in the air, but Lillian rocked her gently, whispering soothing words in her ear. They had made it a few hundred yards into the forest when the sound of voices carried through the trees. Maxwell's heart lurched. Victor's men had found their trail. "This way," Isabella whispered, leading them off the narrow path and deeper into the woods, where the trees were thicker, the undergrowth denser. They moved quickly but carefully, trying to avoid making too much noise. Every snap of a twig beneath their feet sent Maxwell's heart racing, each sound feeling like a beacon that would give them away. But they couldn't hide forever. The sudden crack of a gunshot split the air. Maxwell dropped to the ground, pulling Lillian down with him as they huddled behind a thick tree trunk. Isabella crouched next to them, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "They know we're here," Isabella said, her voice grim. Maxwell clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the situation crashing down on him. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the middle of a forest with nowhere to go. He glanced at Lillian, who was clutching the baby tightly to her chest, her face pale with fear. He had to get them out of this, no matter what it took. Another gunshot echoed through the trees, closer this time. Maxwell's mind raced. They couldn't outrun these men forever. At some point, they would have to stand their ground. But how? He had no weapon, no plan, and the men hunting them were trained killers. His options were dwindling fast. Isabella shifted next to him, her face tense with concentration. "We can't keep running," she said quietly. "We need to make a stand." Maxwell looked at her, his stomach twisting with dread. "How? We're outnumbered, and they have guns. What chance do we have?" Isabella's expression hardened. "There's a clearing up ahead. If we can get there, we might be able to set up some kind of defense. We can't let them trap us in the trees." Maxwell hesitated. The idea of facing Victor's men head-on seemed like a suicide mission. But what choice did they have? They couldn't keep running forever, and the baby needed protection. His mind flashed back to the promise he had made to himself, to protect this child, no matter the cost. "All right," Maxwell said, his voice grim with resolve. "We'll do it." Isabella nodded and motioned for them to move. They rose to their feet, moving quickly but cautiously through the underbrush. The clearing was just ahead, a small patch of open ground surrounded by thick trees. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. They reached the clearing just as another gunshot rang out, this one dangerously close. Maxwell could hear the men's voices now, their footsteps growing louder as they closed in. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Isabella. "What now?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Isabella's eyes were hard, her jaw set. "We fight." Maxwell swallowed hard, his stomach churning. He wasn't a fighter. He was a businessman, a man who had spent his life building wealth and success, not engaging in gunfights in the middle of the woods. But none of that mattered now. This was about survival. His, Lillian's, and the baby's. Lillian crouched low behind a tree, holding the baby close to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded at Maxwell, her resolve clear. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. The first of Victor's men appeared at the edge of the clearing, his gun raised as he scanned the area. Maxwell's breath caught in his throat, his body tensing with fear. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he spotted them. Without hesitation, Isabella fired. The gunshot echoed through the clearing, and the man fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder in pain. Maxwell's heart raced as he realized there was no turning back now. This was it. They were in the fight of their lives. More men emerged from the trees, their guns drawn as they moved toward the clearing. Maxwell crouched low, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. He had no weapon, no plan, only his will to survive. Isabella fired again, hitting another man in the leg. He stumbled, cursing loudly as he fell to the ground. But the others kept coming, their guns blazing as they fired at the group. Maxwell ducked behind a tree, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of gunfire was deafening, the flashes of light illuminating the dark forest around them. Lillian clutched the baby tightly, her face pale with fear, but her eyes filled with determination. Maxwell could see the strain in her expression, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for her life, she was fighting for their future, for the child they had promised to protect. Maxwell's mind raced as he scanned the clearing, searching for anything they could use to their advantage. The men were closing in, their guns trained on them as they moved through the trees. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But they weren't out of hope. With a surge of adrenaline, Maxwell grabbed a thick branch from the ground, his mind racing with a desperate plan. He waited for the right moment, watching as one of the men moved closer, his gun trained on Isabella. And then, with all the strength he could muster, Maxwell swung the branch, striking the man in the head and knocking him to the ground. The man's gun clattered to the ground, and Maxwell wasted no time. He grabbed the weapon, his hands shaking as he fumbled with it. He had never fired a gun before, but in this moment, instinct took over. He aimed at one of the remaining men and fired. The man fell, clutching his chest as he crumpled to the ground. Maxwell's breath came in ragged gasps as the reality of what he had just done sank in. He had killed a man, taken a life in the heat of battle. But there was no time to dwell on it. The fight wasn't over. Isabella fired again, hitting the last of Victor's men in the leg. He stumbled, falling to the ground with a cry of pain. The clearing fell silent, the echoes of gunfire fading into the night. Maxwell stood there, his chest heaving, the gun still clenched in his hand. The danger was over, at least for now, but the weight of what they had just done hung heavily in the air. Lillian rose slowly, the baby still cradled in her arms. She looked at Maxwell, her eyes filled with both fear and gratitude. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Maxwell shook his head, still trying to process everything. "We survived," he said quietly. "But this isn't over. Victor won't stop until he finds us." Isabella approached them, her face grim. "We need to keep moving," she said. "This was just a small group. Victor has more men, and they'll come looking when these ones don't report back." Maxwell nodded, his mind already racing with their next steps. They couldn't stay here. They had to keep moving, keep running. But as he looked at the baby in Lillian's arms, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, they would fight for her. They would fight for their survival, for their future. And they would not let Victor win. As they prepared to leave the clearing and head deeper into the unknown, Maxwell took one last look at the cabin in the distance, now a symbol of everything they had left behind. Their old lives were gone, shattered by the storm of lies, betrayal, and danger. But as long as they had each other, as long as they had this child, they would keep fighting. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more dangers than they could possibly imagine. But Maxwell was no longer the man who had walked into that penthouse just days ago. He had become something more, someone willing to do whatever it took to protect those he loved. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting a golden light over the forest, Maxwell knew that they were not defeated. They were just getting started.